Episode 21 of NBC's Saturday Night Night sees the return of one of the greatest early hosts of the show, deadpan master Buck Henry. The writers and cast have been to the Emmys, and even won a few since last week's episode, so look out for a few mentions of that. Otherwise, I don't have much to tell you in the way of an introduction for this episode, other than to say it's one of the strongest overall shows of the season in terms of sketches. There's not much here that just plain doesn't work, and it's nice that they had another standout installment for their first year. Next week's host is serviceable enough, but we otherwise close the season on two pretty big stinkers who make you appreciate somebody like Buck. I've already done all the biography I need to do of Henry in my LNS video in episode 10, so if you're somehow watching commentary about Saturday Night Live and don't know who he is, maybe go watch that one first. Buck's conspicuously absent for his monologue, so Lorne tells Belushi he's going to have to host. Then Lorne goes on a panicked journey to go find him. They cut back to host Belushi in the studio ranting about how crappy the show is, all cheap jokes and pratfalls. Lorne finds Buck at the entrance to 30 Rock, but security doesn't believe he's famous enough to be the host and won't let him come in. This is something that actually did happen with great regularity to hosts, writers, and others who worked on the 17th floor. The security folks were not used to these types of scruffy hooligans having the run of 30 Rockefeller Plaza, leading to frequent and sometimes violent clashes when folks refused to carry or forgot their IDs. Anyway, John's having a meltdown by the time Henry gets to the stage. This is a wonderfully chaotic start to proceedings, and I can already tell this is going to be a strong show. I love how the inner life of the production is frequently a subject for their material, and it's something that must have felt new and exciting for the time. After all that kerfuffle, of course, Buck's monologue gets cut for time, to which he tersely retorts, "We'll be right back," and moves us on along. Good stuff. Gordon Lightfoot is a folk musician described by many critics as Canada's greatest ever songwriter, although as a huge fan of Joni Mitchell, I might quibble with that assessment. Regardless of my opinion, Lightfoot's huge popularity during the 70s and his towering influence over the music of the period is not in question. Once he signed to major label Warner Reprise in 1970, he began a streak of top 40 albums and singles that was still going strong when he appeared on SNL in May of 1976. Lightfoot's here promoting his soon-to-be-released disc Summertime Dream, which would go on to be his most commercially successful record on the back of its title track and The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald is far too long to perform in this context, however, so he plays the title track and Spanish Moss instead. Both performances are pristine, and the fashion sense on display here makes me smile. My dearly departed father was a young adult in the 60s and 70s, and I can see the formative influence denim-clad folkies like Lightfoot had on Dad's choice of attire. Let's just say there's a lots of blue jean on that stage, and I love it. The dirty phone call has something to do with yogurt this week.
Hot fudge sauce is fattening. We can put yogurt. I gotta go.
Seems unhygienic. Our leadoff story, apparently Ted Kennedy doesn't know whether the hell he's going to run for vice president or not. Polls showed that any Democrat would probably defeat alleged President Gerald Ford in the general election, and what do you know, any Democrat did. Mitt Romney's dad gets a shout-out, just in case you forgot that family has been in politics and governments forever. 73% of Americans said they'd be okay with a woman president. Of the remainder, 6% preferred David Bowie. That's a good third option, I suppose. A massive manhunt is underway. Chevy tells us where, but doesn't say for what. Reagan looks like a doofus in file footage. Carter has big teeth in file footage. A piece on an accident on the set of a shark movie. Chevy reads the whole piece like he's underwater.
I couldn't believe it. We were surrounded all morning by deadly balloons. The sea life was such algae and small fish little around the area of the great.
It's a cool voice and gets a good laugh. Gilda has the advert for Germisol house deodorant. It's dippy as hell, but also actually kind of comforting to think advertising used to be simple like this. Nothing meta, it just unironically tries to sell you a product. Imagine that. Quaint. We have a held-nosed Chevy report from the Hearst trial, this time over file footage of a nutrition documentary for kids. Francisco Franco is still dead, more updates to come. And finally, the Television Comedy Has-Beens Awards were televised this week from Hollywood. Ouch. Win gracefully much, SNL? Gary Weiss's movie this week is Buck Henry subjecting random strangers to interrogation and undue scrutiny as they shop for toilet seats. I can only imagine how uncomfortable these poor random schlubs must have been being accosted by cameras and rather intense questioning by Buck whilst attempting to pick out a crapper. It's quirky for quirk's sake, but not what I'd call entertaining. It's nice that Wise made a point to include the host, though, which he seems to only do occasionally. The punchline, if you'd call it that, comes in the form of a voiceover from Henry at the end, lamenting how far he'd fallen to be doing a dumb film about toilet seats like this. I chuckled. Chevy seriously injured his leg accepting an Emmy, and so Lorraine is going to do the fall for him this week.
Good evening, everybody. I'm afraid I have some disheartening news for some of you. Unfortunately, I seriously injured my leg earlier this week, accepting an Emmy award. Thank you.
Chevy humble brags on himself about his Emmy and tells everyone how Lorraine probably won't be as funny as him, because he won an Emmy and all, and ladies aren't built for physical comedy. He really plays into the caricature of himself as an egotistical jerk. Lorraine comes out, thanks him for the opportunity, and yanks him by the crutch onto a table. It's a good fall and a good gag.
Live from New York, it's Saturday night!
Chevy does an ad for the Peter Lemon Mood Ring, which is about as dated a 70s sketch as is imaginable. It's a parody of cabaret singer Peter Lemongello and, well, mood rings. You'll have to go look those things up for yourself, as I refuse to explain either of them. The gag is that they use a camera trick to make Chevy's skin change color along with the song he's singing, like a mood ring changes color with your emotions. I had to research why this is funny, so it's not, but it's an interesting thing for them to attempt on live TV. It's only about 3 minutes, though, and feels about 2 minutes too long. This gets the coveted worst award thing by a pretty wide margin on an otherwise pretty good show. In which John gets to mime honeymoon sex with his sword and scabbard. Yay! Henry is in to get his tuxedo for his wedding, and hilarity, of course, ensues. They managed to get some entendre jokes like Henry's sword hanging low and to the left in there. I'd imagine a lot of this suggestive sexual humor was completely lost on the censors when they read the scripts. The punchline comes when Buck complains that his pants don't have a zipper or button fly. After all, we're talking about my wedding night, he says. Of course, Belushi prepares to oblige him using his katana, and we freeze frame on the shot in a to-be-continued kind of moment. This one's quite strong, and I hope they had the sense to reserve the samurai stuff for when Buck's the host from now on. This is a much better outing than the one we had with Peter Boyle. In which Buck plays a host on a call-in show about an extremely dry subject. Nobody calls in, there's lots of dead air, and Henry pulls the whole thing off wonderfully. I can see why they wanted to have him back, and why he came back so many times after this. I can't think of too many other hosts who could play dry, emotionless non-humor as well as Buck does here. Maybe Charles Grodin. Anyway, Frank changes the subject to a more lively topic, forced busing. Still only one caller, a wrong number who hangs up before Buck can answer. Getting desperate, Frank tries to bait the audience into calling by saying he's in favor of Soviet-style communism here in the United States. No takers. Finally, Gilda comes out and drags poor Frank off air. Like I said, this would have been a poor sketch for other hosts, but Buck makes it work. Danny shills for Del Stater's 99-cent Toad Ranch restaurant. This is the same sort of overhyped pitchman that Aykroyd does in lots of other skits, such as the extremely similar Mel's Char Palace spot, but this time featuring a southern accent the others feel compelled to try to emulate for some reason. Poorly. Still fun. Garrett has one of those weird, no-kidding Polaroid adverts. These seem stranger and more out of place as the season goes on, but apparently Lauren really wanted to make sure that all the cast members got to participate in one for the extra exposure and money. I'm sure Garrett could probably use both after a relatively underutilized first season, and he could probably sell the hell out of a used car, too. He's a good pitchman. Buck plays a director who's micromanaging the casting of his film. He's casting a crowd scene. He addresses the entire assembled group of folks as one, and they respond as such. It's a good ensemble piece, performed as well as it could be, but it's not particularly noteworthy. Buck runs them through various scenarios, and it's hard to take your eyes off of Belushi and Lorraine. They're entertaining. It takes a really dark turn towards the end. Henry asks the group, "Oh, one more thing. Do you lynch?" At which point Danny produces a rope and they mime stringing up Garrett. I don't know what kind of movie Buck's making, but I don't want to see it. This might have gotten some complaints, and it did obviously never get close to airing as is today, but it's an interesting artifact at the times, nonetheless. Lorne ups the ante on his offer to the Beatles. He says that since they won an Emmy, NBC can now offer them $3,200 instead of $3,000. Pardo gives a great spiel about the exceptional, although in reality quite modest accommodations they'll be given, in 4 separate rooms, no less, at the Crosstown Motor Inn. This is such a great premise. I can't wait for George Harrison's eventual appearance. Bob Wawawa interviews Lena Wertmüller, an Italian director who happens to have a silly accent. This series of interviews has exactly one joke. They talk funny. The girls tried their damnedest, but this is another example of Lorraine really throwing herself into a role which isn't very entertaining or memorable, just a bad accent. Not bad, though, and people seem to really respond to Gilla's portrayal of Barbara Walters. Jane interviews Henry as a sexologist who can't actually mention or speak of the act of sex without getting uncomfortable and failing to express himself. Henry does a good job looking antsy and fidgeting as Jane tries to prod him into using more precise language, but the best poor Buck can do is make a gesture with his fingers. Another great example of why he's a wonderful host. This is a sketch where both of them are ostensibly playing the straight man, but it's still funny. That's a neat trick. Garrett has a star turn singing a beautiful Schubert piece, which he nails, while text scrolls over top explaining that when they agreed to let him do it, they thought he'd do something a little more upbeat and popular, but when he then suggested a classical piece, they had to just let him do it. He carries a knife, after all, it says. 2.5 minutes of quality singing by a very talented performer, with a silly sight gag thrown in for good measure. This is a strong show for Garrett, and it's about time. Here's O'Donoghue, this time as Tony Orlando, again with needles jammed in his eyes. These work because of Michael's setups. He really nails the smarmy, bow-tied professional showbiz hack role, so when he slips into the impression, it really catches you off guard. At least it would have if you hadn't caught him doing pretty much the exact same routine about 10 episodes earlier. I can't help but feel it's made worse by the other folks doing the gag with him this time, but that's not to say it doesn't work at all. Rather hilariously, we're all still rolling around with spikes jammed in our eyes as Henry comes back to close the show. Not much to say here other than this was a strong outing, worthy of a show which had just been given one of TV's biggest honors. Stick around as the next few weeks have some fun stories to tell, even if they're not exactly packed with overly strong material. Stay tuned.